Our next speaker is Cólín Drisceoil of National Monument Service. Cólín used to run Kilkenny archaeology, and he directed numerous excavations all over the country, including a wonderful excavation that he directed at High Hayes, where there was a fantastic medieval pottery kiln discovered. Cólín has a wide range of publications and interests, everything from the Romans in Ireland to medieval sculpture. He did a wonderful excavation in St. Mary's, which is at the end of the Golden Mile, as they call it, or the Medieval Mile, in Kilkenny. And that medieval church has now been opened to the public. So a vast amount of work has been done by Cólín. He used to edit the Old Kilkenny Review, and he has a list of publications the length of your arm, which he can tell you about later. But right now, he's going to talk about the archaeology of the rivers. Over to you, Cólín.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much, Jim, for your introduction. Sorry for cutting your coffee short, and I hope this is worth it. So, The River Remembers. I found this lovely poem there recently, and it called The River Remembers, and I think it speaks nicely to the theme of my talk today. I'm going to talk to you kind of in very general terms about the sorts of archaeology that we find in our rivers here in Ireland. I'm going to be using a lot of examples from my own neck of the woods, where I've done a fair bit of research in Kilkenny, Tipperary. I worked for many years doing these things called heritage audits of the rivers Nore. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing, these are very detailed, comprehensive audits of the entire built archaeological, cultural and natural heritage of these very important riverscapes, the Nore and the Shore. So I'm going to be talking a fair bit about those. Not going to be talking too much about Galway. Galway are playing Kilkenny tomorrow. I have a really bad feeling about it. So that's why I'm going to try and pump up Kilkenny from here. So the River Remembers. Ireland is very much a land of rivers. This is a fantastic map. This shows all of the inland waterways of the country. And you can just see the density of rivers and lakes, and it is extraordinary when you put it all together. Somebody has actually gone to the trouble. They must have had way too much time on their hands. They added up the entire length of waterways that we have in the country, and it comes to a grand total of 93,000 kilometres of rivers and streams. What's really interesting about that, though, is the fact that that covers about 2.5% of the total land area of the state. What's really interesting about that is that that's about twice the EU average. So we are a land of rivers and lakes. We are a people that are intrinsically, and certainly were intrinsically, bound up with these waterscapes. The beauty of these waterscapes, which has been so fantastically demonstrated by Carl in his work and Michael in his work also earlier on today, is the level of preservation that they afford archaeological sites, monuments, wrecks, logboats, the whole shebang. And rivers are no different to lakes in that sense. So that poem I was telling you about, it's by an American poet, Lucian Meadows, and I think he captures that really nicely. And he says, "What happens in the river remembers. What we give to the river in one generation, the river will transmute into another." And it's that preservation of these lost memories of the past that are kind of embodied, I suppose, in the archaeology that we find in the rivers. That the wrecks, the sites, the stuff of archaeology, that's how the river remembers. And the study, how do we get those memories? How do we get that archaeological information out of the rivers? Well, we provide all sorts of archaeological investigation techniques like diving, these heritage audits, the archaeological surveys, excavations in and around rivers. Thing is, there hasn't been too much of that done in Ireland. Our riverine archaeology, as it's kind of called, isn't quite as far as advanced here as it would be elsewhere in Europe. Riverine archaeology provides us, though, with really unique insights into who we are as a people, where we've come from as communities and as a people. And critically, it's how we placed rivers at the centre of how our lives were lived in the past. And so what I'm going to do is talk to you, just going to give you a flavour, I suppose, in the time I have available, to the sorts of archaeological sites and objects and wrecks and logboats, etc., that are to be found in and along our rivers. This is the heritage audit of the River Nore, one small section of it that was published there a few years ago. A wonderful project where we combined archaeology, cultural heritage, natural heritage, folklore, all into one big comprehensive study of the entirety of the River Nore. And we did the same with the River Shore as well. In my days at Kilkenny Archaeology, they were produced on behalf of Tipperary County Council, Kilkenny County Council, and funded chiefly by the Heritage Council. And they're a great way to kind of figure out what you have in a particular riverscape. And when we started doing these audits, we reckoned we might, between the two of them, that we might end up with maybe 1,000 archaeological sites. When we finished, we were up at 10,000. And so about 90% of the archaeology that was recorded along these rivers has never previously been recorded. And it just gives you an idea, an insight, I suppose, into just the wealth of material that is waiting to be discovered in and around the rivers of this country. So the sorts of sites that we find on our rivers, first of all, they're sites of communication and travel. Rivers provided the main access routes into the interior of the country. And here's Ptolemy's famous map from 140 AD. And you can see he's marked about 15 rivers, the entrances into the 15 river systems that provided a map about how he's telling the Romans and his compatriots how to get into the interior of the country in the 2nd century AD. We can match some of these rivers that he has at the time. We can match them with our modern river names. So there's the Asoba over here is the River Corrib, and he's showing in 140 AD the entrance, Galway Bay, in the entrance up into the the Corrib system. And, you know, it was important in 140 AD. And, you know, Carl's work and Michael's work has shown that with flying colours about why they're materialising what's shown on Ptolemy's map here in demonstrating its importance. The Bovinda over here is the River Boyne, and then you've got of course, Senos, the River Shannon. So the rivers are very much the highways of the past. And how did people get up and down them? There's all sorts of vessels that were used, and then there's a whole infrastructure that's built around these. There's the ferries and the quays and the jetties, canals, navigations in later times. So broad range of watercraft were used. Log boats, as Carl has shown us earlier on, were in use on the rivers from prehistoric times, probably from the Mesolithic, as has been shown in Lough Corrib, almost certainly, right up until the 17th or maybe the 18th century. And they are multifunctional. You know, they're used for all sorts of things: fishing, travel, transport, exploitation of natural resources, warfare as well. And here's a really nice one that was found. Carl was involved in this project here. This is a log boat that was found in the River Boyne at Old Bridge, found by local anglers, and it was removed from the river then by the Underwater Archaeology Unit in the National Monument Service, who I work for, and subsequently dated, would you believe, to about 3000 BC. So it's around exactly the same age as the Newgrange passage tomb over here. So it's not a great stretch of the imagination to believe that somebody who was involved in Newgrange actually used this boat, this log boat, back in 3000 BC. Another great spot for log boats is up at River Foyle. I was up there a few months ago with Carl, and we were examining a number of log boats. There seems to have been a harbour upriver from Lifford and Strabane, where there's a rake of these log boats, and they keep every flood that goes through the river, it washes out some of them, and they end up downstream of Lifford. And here's one really nice example. As far as I know, they haven't been dated yet, but they're probably, late prehistoric to medieval in date. And I think there's about 20 or 30 of them known from that particular area at present. So log boats, one important way of getting around your river systems at the time. Various other vessels, and I won't go into, there's loads of different types, but one interesting one, I suppose, is these square-sailed boats. And you can see here's a view of Athlone from Limerick from 1827, and it just shows how sails were used as a method of propulsion on these boats right up until the 19th century. And they're shown also on this lovely image of the River Nore at Inistioge in County Kilkenny. And you can see here, there's a square-sailed boat on the river, and with loads of images of these going up and down the River Nore at the time. And the other thing to bear in mind is that an awful lot of boats were pulled by humans or by animals, by animal traction as well, up and down the river. So you get these flat-bottomed barges, and they would have been used in areas where there's shallow water, and there was thousands of these working the rivers, bringing cargo up and down. These ones would have been bringing material up from New Ross Port down at the bottom of the River Nore system, and upriver to Kilkenny, Thomastown, and the various towns up along the way. So, and barges had to be provided with specific tow paths then that allowed for them to be pulled up and down. Obviously, rivers had to be crossed as well, so there was lots and lots of fording points, and at least from the early medieval period, and possibly earlier, there were bridges being built here in the country. The oldest one we know of so far, 804 AD, dated by dendrochronology, famously is the one that was discovered and partially excavated at Clonmacnoise, and it's our oldest known bridge, formed of at least about 100 of these vertical oak timbers, and they supported the bridge that went across the River Shannon. There's a lovely reconstruction of it here by Gavin from Real Sim. Right beside the bridge, again, there was 11 dugout canoes found, as well as a range of important artefacts. One of the canoes had carpentry tools found in it, and it's, this is probably a boat, a log boat that was lost by one of the carpenters who was building the bridge at the time in the early 9th century. A bit closer to where we are now, Ballinasloe. We know from the annals that there was a bridge in 1120 built by Tordelbach O'Connor, who was king of Connacht at the time, and he builds, according to the annals, a bridge at Ballinasloe. At the same time, he builds bridges across the Shannon at Lough and one in Shannon Harbour, I think. The annals seem to describe bridges that are being built of wickerwork hurdles, and that reminds us of the cargo that was in that lovely wreck that Carl described earlier on in Lough Corrib. The bridge in Ballinasloe was succeeded probably by a whole suite of them, but the one that's there at the moment is an amalgam of a late 16th century bridge that was a military bridge that was built by Sir Henry Sidney, and it was then enlarged in the 18th century. It's one of about 21 or 22 standing bridges dating from before 1600 in the country. It's an incredibly important structure. It's one, and it's, as far as I can tell, it's the longest medieval bridge left in the country. So a very, very important structure there. So bridges are built for all sorts of practical functions to allow for areas of river to be crossed. But they're also built as kind of as good works to attract prayers and the admiration, I suppose, of the community as well. And there's a really good example of that, Holy Cross on the river shore. There's Holy Cross Abbey, this Cistercian Abbey, and there's a medieval bridge here, still stands today, and it was built by the Dunboyne butlers in 1626. And there's a fantastic inscription on it here, and it talks all about every person who crosses the bridge has to say a prayer. Please say a prayer for our souls. The soul of James Butler, who's the Baron of Dunboyne, and his wife, Margaret O'Brien. And they ask for prayers to be said by every single person who crosses the bridge. And the inscription ends, "Say, I beg you, before you go away this short prayer, may the two who built it escape the pit of hell." So, I don't know, they must have been up to something. Exactly. That's Tipperary for you.
They might have burnt their bridges.
They might have burnt the bridges. So where we find, 18th, 19th and earlier bridges, there's often a succession of earlier bridges, the remnants of which can be found in the rivers either below or upstream or downstream of the existing bridge. And there's a great example of that from Kilkenny. This is one of the finest classical bridges, built 1768 in Kilkenny, Green's Bridge over the River Nore. Beautiful example based on a Roman bridge from the 3rd century in a place called Rimini in Italy. And it's an exact replica of it. And this bridge replaced a 16th century bridge that was constructed in 1560 by the Bishop of Ossory, Bishop Cantwell, and it was destroyed in the Great Flood of Kilkenny in 1763, which just went like a tsunami through the River Nore, and it wiped out every single bridge on the Nore. And the power of the flood at that time was just absolutely extraordinary. And we have archaeological evidence of that power. I'll show you now in a second. So there's been a survey. Jimmy Lenihan, an underwater archaeologist, did a survey of the bridge, and here it is. This is Bishop Cantwell's bridge on an 18th century map of Kilkenny. You can see it very clearly there. It's covering a mill race here, crossing, and this is the last surviving arch that remains of it. You can see Gothic arch. And here's Jimmy doing his survey. So when you look upstream of the present Green's Bridge, you can see these little mounds in the river. And what they are, when Jimmy went down and had a look at them, he found things like there's a crowbar in the river where they were trying to grub out the stonework from that had collapsed after the Great Flood in 1763, presumably to allow for navigation. But he also found that there was lots of the arches of the original 16th century bridge, which had literally just been pushed over entirely by the Great Flood in 1763, and they're still intact on the bottom of the river there. So you can see that. You see that lovely arch there? Yeah. Just shows you the power of the flood. And again, some of the timber, these bridges were founded generally on kind of timber piles or timber platforms, and this is a remnant of one of them. You can see the dowel holes here. Another nice example is at the other end of Kilkenny. This is John's Bridge, built 1910. At the time it was built, it was the longest reinforced concrete bridge in Ireland. And it replaced a whole succession of about a dozen other bridges that were crossing the River Nore here. Just, as you can see, just below Kilkenny Castle. This was always a great strategic crossing point of the River Nore, and William Marshall set up his castle here at Kilkenny deliberately to overlook that strategic crossing. And there was a flood relief scheme in Kilkenny back in the early 2000, 2001, and they ended up finding all sorts of absolutely extraordinary archaeology in this area as well as elsewhere on the Nore at the time. One of the things they found was the remnants, of the medieval bridge. And you can see here, this is the medieval bridge, 16th century bridge that was pushed over again, like the one on the other side of town, by the power of the water in 1763 again. You got these arches that are intact. Great surprise was underneath the abutments of this bridge here, which was built in 1777 after the Great Flood, was the foundations of the abutments were reinforced by about 20 beautiful medieval grave slabs that had been probably taken from the Augustinian Abbey next door, or maybe St. Mary's Parish Church up the road. And they had been literally wedged in under the abutments to stop scouring of the ground and to reinforce them. And one of the finest is this lovely incised effigy from the late 13th century of a monk. Now, he's probably an Augustinian monk. You can see there's his tonsure and there's his hair. Beautiful. But because this was placed front side down on the river bed, it survived really, really well. So beautiful. That's now on display in the Medieval Mile Museum. So rivers were absolutely vital for the economy of our medieval towns. They provided really important trade links. And just from a rough thought of, there's about 52 major medieval towns in Ireland. And as far as I can tell, every single one of them, bar Cashel, is on a river. There's Rindoon as well, which is on Lough. But they're all on rivers. There's a very good reason for that, and is that they were absolutely essential for the economic well-being of the town. You can see on this map that John Bradley produced of the medieval towns and boroughs of Tipperary. You can see all of the major medieval towns, bar Cashel, are on rivers, but also the smaller towns, the boroughs as well. The same thing. They're all part of a kind of market-based economy that uses the rivers to funnel the produce down the rivers from the manors and then down to the major towns, but also out of the major ports as well. And that's providing for in the other areas of the lordship in Wales and England. And the same thing in Kilkenny. You can see there are a whole rake of towns on the River Nore. And this is a plan of medieval Kilkenny, and you can just see how important the river is absolutely at the centre of the medieval town. There's Kilkenny Castle there, there's the John's Bridge, Green's Bridge up here, and the River Brega, Tribbertree. So this was navigable in the medieval period, and there was a quayside constructed probably about here, and this was a working quayside in the medieval town. And you wouldn't think it today by looking at the River Nore in Kilkenny that it could have had a working quayside like that, but there certainly was one. And the thing about rivers is they flood, and I've reconstructed through kind of synthesizing the various archaeological excavations and geotechnical boreholes and things like that have took place inside in the medieval town. You can reconstruct from that all the places. When you put all the places together that have produced kind of alluvial deposits or reclamation deposits, that kind of thing, you can see this is the original. The grey here is the original floodplain of the River Nore, and this is it today. So all of this grey here, there's the wall town, all of this grey had to be reclaimed from the floodplain of the Nore. And exact same thing happened in virtually every medieval town in Ireland. And so this was all done. We've got really good dating for a lot of this, and it was all done in one massive operation between the early and the mid 13th century in Kilkenny. And this is replicated throughout the Anglo-Norman colony. And the Burgess charters give rights to the burgesses of the towns to, as it says, extend into the river. And it's been promoted, it's been subsidised by the lord of the town. But an absolutely extraordinary amount of material had to be dumped into the foreshore of the river, constantly pushing the river back. And it was done by building these things called revetments. They're like timber fences, and there's one built, and then a whole lot of refuse and rock and that kind of thing is put in behind it, filled up, and then they go on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, constantly at war with the river, pushing it back, and to make land for new ground. The beauty of this kind of reclamation archaeology is that it's all waterlogged, so the alluvial deposits are wet and they are beautifully preserving things like the timbers, the leather, and paleo-environmental remains, the likes of which are just extraordinary. I mean, you can pick up, I was involved in an excavation around here back in 2005, and we excavated a perfectly intact 13th century refuse pit, which had its timber sides still beautifully preserved, and the whole thing was full of plumb stones, filled to the brim with plumb stones, and you could almost see the teeth marks on some of the plums. They were that well preserved, so it was quite amazing. So rivers in towns have always, of course, been used as dumping grounds for not just for reclamation, but for they're handy places to get rid of your refuse in the pre-plastic era. So we find thousands of objects in our rivers, and the River Nore flood scheme produced about 6,500 objects, everything from the tiniest little early Mesolithic flint. I don't know how on earth somebody spotted it, but they did. You can see how this is an archaeologist, and he or she, they're monitoring the excavation of the channel of the River Nore here, and just about there they found the much better eyesight than me anyway, and they found a little early Mesolithic flint, the earliest object that's been found in the city to date. But huge array of pottery, mad little things like this little unicycle, a medieval spearhead, lots and lots of architectural fragments and the like. So an amazing kind of overview, I suppose, of the material culture of the medieval and the post-medieval town. This is an object that somebody just showed to me there, a guy called Carl Ryan in Kilkenny. He was out fishing in the river there a couple of years ago, and he picked up this. It's a slate with a carving, a graffiti of what looks to me like sort of a biblical boat. You can see that there, and there's the mast. Very similar to the kind of graffitis that we see, for example, on plaster in churches and the like. Like there's loads of them in Moyne Abbey, for example, and Carl has and Chris Corlett have written papers on these ship graffitis, as they're called. So this is one on slate. What was its original purpose? Maybe it was used in teaching, something like that. That's one suggestion. But it appears to be, it's so close to the medieval ship graffitis in the churches that you'd have to suspect it's of medieval date. So the river holds these objects in extraordinary numbers. Another lovely little find that was found in the flood relief works just by John's Bridge in Kilkenny was this posy ring. And you can let your imagination run riot, thinking of why did a lovely romantic posy ring end up in the river? Was there a row and she pulled it off and feck you? But it says, there's a lovely inscription on it, as sure to thee as death to me. So beautiful. Rivers as well provide really formidable natural defences, and that's why castles are often placed along rivers, because of that kind of double function that they use, and they're also keeping an eye on the traffic going up and down the river. You've got the Kilkenny Castle there. You've got the same thing in Cahir Care Castle overlooking the River Shore. There's a medieval bridge in Care, really fabulous example of it. And if you look at the Bacata Hibernica map of Limerick from 1623, you can see there's Limerick Harbour here. Right, you can see that. And there's a little tower here, another tower here, and between them, they've got a chain. So the harbour and a lot of our rivers were guarded by these things called chain towers. And this is big, massive chain is strung out between the two towers, and that controls who can and can't get into the medieval town. And amazingly enough, there was one of these excavated by Ian Doyle in Kilkenny, and there's the remains of it here. It's one side of it, and then its twin was over on the other side of the. So that's the toll tower, the chain tower here, and then its twin was over here. The chain put up across the River Nore. I presume there was something similar here in Galway. And the other thing about castles and rivers is there's an awful lot of castles that are sited beside rivers and watery places where there's an awful lot of mythology attached to them. And we know, for example, Edward I, who's the great castle builder of medieval England, completely revolutionises castle architecture in the 13th century. And he is big into mysticism and Merlin and King Arthur and all that stuff. And he deliberately cites some of his great castles like Harlech and Beaumaris. They're deliberately cited in areas where they're beside rivers and lakes where there's mythology along those lines attached to them. And you can find the same thing. This is Edward I's castle, great castle at Roscommon. And this is right on the edge of the Rathcroghan ritual landscape. And you'd have to think that's no coincidence that Edward puts a castle there. Closer to home here, Castletown, Kiltartan, near Gurt. Beautiful 13th century castle, again, almost certainly built by Edward I. And where does he put it? Right beside this extraordinary natural feature in the landscape, a swallow hole, where the Gurt River literally disappears underground. And there's a whole suite of legends attached to this swallow hole, and the most important of them is that the St. Colman of Kilmacdua is said to, the mother of St. Colman, Rina, is said to have been drowned in this swallow hole here. So again, that's it. These rivers are important for all sorts of reasons in the siting of our medieval castles. Find rivers integrated into designed landscapes of the 18th and 19th century. This is Mount Juliet in Kilkenny on the River Nore, very deliberately sited to take advantage of the river. You can see it on the historic maps. You can see there's about a dozen of them on the northern River Nore, where they're deliberately, the designed landscapes of the landed estates are deliberately placed on the rivers. Natural resources provided by rivers are also of huge importance. Fish and fowl are plentiful on the rivers, particularly in these times, and they're a mainstay of the diet for millennia. So there's a huge variety of different ways of catching fish and catching fowl. And a lot of the material evidence for this remains in the rivers today. Like this is a lovely fish trap from the 15th century that was discovered by Aidan O'Sullivan in a survey of the Shannon. This is in the Fergus Estuary in County Clare. You can see there's the timbers that have survived and wattle fence. And so the idea is that the fish swim in here and they're kind of funneled into an area here, and then they're either speared or they're exactly like Mick was shown earlier on. They're captured in this area here. So, but there's a whole load of different types of these fish traps. Again, back to Kilkenny, an extraordinary one was found underneath John's Bridge, just over here, and it miraculously had survived the construction above it of a whole series of bridges from the medieval period onwards. And this was subsequently, this is a fish trap of, you can see the panels here of wicker work, and this was radiocarbon dated to the Iron Age, would you believe? They have a long, long history. All the rivers in the country would have had eel weirs and salmon weirs, and the remains of those can be seen. There are lots of the historic maps generally show lots and lots of examples of them. There's one from Tipperary. There's one below, probably of medieval date, below the 13th century, Grennan Castle, just outside Thomastown on the River Nore, and there's the remains of an eel weir here. Salmon fishing was done on an industrial scale, for particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, and certainly on the River Nore, and probably on other rivers, I'd say as well, they used to do this thing called snap net fishing. So if you look, this is a photograph from the 1950s. There's two boats, and what they do is they encircle the salmon with a net, and then the two boats go in further and further together, and then they snap the nets together, and the salmon are caught, and then they're hauled out onto the land. But in order to be able to see where the salmon are, this is before there was drones or any of that, they used to build these big towers, and they'd have a fella on the top of the tower, and he'd tell the fishermen in the snap cots where the salmon were, and they'd go out and catch them. And there's still a little bit of it going on the River Nore in Kilkenny. There's a few licenses issued every year. So these are fellas down below in Inistioge doing snap net fishing. Rod fishing definitely goes back to the medieval period, if not before. It really takes off in the 17th and 18th century, both as a leisure activity, but also it's an important source of food. And it's a lovely 18th century view of Kilkenny with a fella here doing rod fishing on the Nore. And here's an ad from Kilkenny. Come to Kilkenny for the fishing and catch more than you expect. I don't think they meant that, what we might infer out of that, but I don't think they'd use it for their tourist brochures these days. That's from about 30 years ago. The lovely thing about the angling tradition on the rivers is that the anglers tend to give every little bend and innie an area of rapids. They have their own names for them. And one of the nice things we did on these surveys of the Northern Shore was that we mapped all of those river names, and we had loads of meetings with the local angling groups, and we spoke to them and recorded all the lovely names that they had for the different parts of the river. So again, it's a dying tradition, and it's important that these names are recorded, I think, on our other rivers as well. And there's some these are some really nice ones down below in Inistioge, of the head of the bridge pond and the duck pond and so forth there. So they're a really nice part of our heritage. If you look at any historic, particularly first edition Ordnance Survey map of any Irish river, you'll see these references to these things called osiers. And what these are plantations of managed willow and hazel, where you can see that's what this line of trees is here, which were then exploited. They're grown on the sides of the rivers, they're pollarded or coppiced. So these are pollarded willow trees, and then because the rods grow really, really long and straight, and then they're chopped off and made into all sorts of basketry and for construction. And this is exactly what was found in Carol's log boat at the bottom of Lough Corrib. And so a very, very long tradition of basketry and They're a really, really important resource that our rivers provided. They're the osiers. Back in the past, of course, there was no electricity. Sorry, just before I go on to that, you have to remember as well when the levels of the rivers go down, vegetation sprouts up, and they're also a very important part of, they provide an important source of food for cattle and grazing and so forth. And in the medieval period, you'd see in the town Burgess charters that there's managed water meadows called inches, usually on the outskirts of the towns, where there's areas are allowed to flood, and there's a whole infrastructure that goes along with them that allows for summer grazing in the water meadows. So they're an important resource. So before there was ESB, rivers and water was the only power that was available. And you get a real sense of the power of the river. Apparently it's Ireland's highest weir, just outside Bennettsbridge on the River Nore. And the power of the water coming here. And this hydropower powers 4 different mills on the Nore in Bennettsbridge. The power that was provided by the rivers is harnessed to power mills, the whole series of mills and vertical water wheels, horizontal water wheels in earlier days, and they're used for grinding, for rolling, hammering. Anything that can be produced by in a mill is using hydropower. And what you find, where there's a mill today, if you look back at the records, or if there's an archaeological excavation, you'll always find, like the bridges, that there's a whole succession of earlier mills, usually on the same spot. And where you see a mill, you have to remember as well that there's this vast infrastructure that went along with the mills. You've got revetments where they're lining the sides of the river upstream just to make sure that the bank doesn't fall off and go into the mill race and clog up the mill wheels. You've got mill ponds, leats, you've got all the warehouses, and so a really lovely example of it here on the first edition map. This is in County Tipperary, Turtala, and you can see there's your mill ponds, your mill, and so they're an enormous enterprise in their own right. And this sort of hydropower allowed all sorts of innovations to occur, particularly in the 18th century. And you get entrepreneurs, people like William Collis down in Kilkenny, where he invents a way of cutting and polishing stone to create Kilkenny marble, which is known throughout the world. And this is a lovely image of his marble mill in Maddoxtown in County Kilkenny. There's the man himself, and there's his cutting machine powered by the river. And the fireplaces and the Kilkenny marble, very distinctive with all these little fossils that when it's polished, it turns this lovely black colour. And they're found, every big house in London had one of these in the 18th century. There's one in the White House as well today. And they were without the technology provided by the river, this would never have happened. And then lastly, and by no means least, and it's been referred to in Carol's talk and in Michael's talk earlier on as well, is the use of watery places and rivers as the foci of pre-Christian, especially late prehistoric religious and foci for religious and cult practices. So we find an absolutely vast amount of late prehistoric, in particular, military metalwork. So the swords and the spears, the axes, shields, horns, all of this stuff is found in many of our rivers, most particularly in the Shannon and the Bann rivers. And, as Michael mentioned earlier on, this tells us that these were regarded as particularly sacred rivers. They're natural, geographical boundaries, and they, I suppose in many ways, they connect kind of political power with religious belief. They connect the living and the dead then with the spirit world. And if we look to, this is the famous Ban disc, which found in the River Ban in the 19th century. And this is just a selection of some of the Bronze Age swords that were found in the River Shannon when it was when the Shannon was dredged over in Killaloe and stuff in the 19th century. A huge amount of prestige metalwork was found at the time. And the other thing we find in our rivers at the time, especially when you go to Iron Age England, the key mortuary tradition for the Iron Age in England is the deposition of skulls. Following the exposure of the body, there's a thing called excarnation. They take the skulls and they deposit them in the rivers. And there's been hundreds of examples of skulls found like these ones here in the River Thames, and they're found in the rivers and in other watery places. And if you look to the land, there's very little burial on land at this time. There's very little in the archaeological record. So it seems, certainly in England, and I think we're getting towards that stage here in Ireland as well, that it's a bit like, the Ganges, where the river is the primary place of burial for the dead. And there's been isotopic analysis done of these human remains from the period, and the extraordinary thing is that tells us that people were eating virtually no freshwater fish at the time. So with all of these burials being put into the rivers, maybe the people turned against eating the fish from the rivers and the lakes at the time, which is amazing to think. So they didn't want to eat, and this is Jim's one, they didn't want to eat fish fingers. That's your one. And all of this makes the very recent discovery from the last few years by my colleague in the underwater archaeology unit, Connie Kelleher, in a licensed archaeological investigation in the Shannon, just near Portumna, on the Tipperary Galway border. We'll give it to Galway, given where we are at the moment, but there's an extraordinary collection there of late Bronze Age and early Iron Age weaponry and human skull, all from the same area. So it's 5 human skulls, and here's a lovely late Bronze Age, early Iron Age dagger, a looped and socketed axe. This is a bronze one, and there's also an iron one, which is a very, very early Iron Age example, and a bear skull found in amongst the whole lot of it, a whole series of animal bones as well. And now, none of the skulls have been definitively dated yet, but it could be that they are Iron Age, late Bronze Age, and they're contemporary with the metalwork, which is very similar to the scenario that I've just described in England, where you're getting very special places on the rivers where there's human and military metalwork all been put in together. The one thing that's missing from the rivers, though, is gold. So the gold seems to have a different meaning in late prehistory than the military metalwork. I'll just finish by saying that rivers are ancient, moving, living things. They're vast repositories of the material remains of the past. But people have been at war with rivers for hundreds, if not thousands, of years in many ways, but particularly in the last 100 years or so, between arterial drainage and reclamation works and the straightening out of rivers, the dredging of rivers, and flood relief works and the like. And it kind of brings to mind this lovely quote that the American writer Toni Morrison wrote. And she says, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact, it is not flooding. It is remembering. Remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. So I'll leave it there, and thanks very much.